Welcome to Knife Chats. If you like what you see, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, share it with friends, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Thank you.
One of these knives is not like the others. I know that seems kind of strange considering they all look different, but actually all of these knives are very much similar with the exception of just one knife, and that's because all of these knives are whittlers except for one. One is not a whittler. And now before I go on, back in the middle of the 20th century, say from 1940 to 1960, 70, a lot of people who looked at knives said that the whittler really wasn't a knife. It isn't a pattern. And I guess in some ways they're correct, but at least back then. But today the whittler has really become a pattern. It is a specific pattern because it has a certain type of blade choice that is unique to whittlers, and the way those blades are lined up these days is pretty much unique to whittlers. And that's why today I think you can safely say that the whittler is an actual pattern, even though there is a variety of frames that are used within the whittler family. So like the stockman, which is what the whittler comes from, it has a variety within the family, but there are some things that are very specific to whittlers which make a whittler a whittler. But that doesn't change the old argument that basically you can whittle with any knife. You can whittle with a barlow. That is definitely a barlow. You can obviously whittle with a 5-inch lockback or a pen knife or just about any other knife you can whittle. However, certain knives are better at whittling than other knives, and that's why the whittler became a pattern all onto its own. Now here's the knife that was not like the others. This is a stockman. And what makes this a stockman is you've got a clip blade, a sheepfoot blade, and a spay blade. And that's the most common blade you find on a stockman. Yeah, you will find some other blades occasionally, but those are primarily the blades you find on a stockman. Now here is an early whittler. And notice this is by Camillus. Here is the Boy Scout whittler. And looks very much from the outside to be a stockman. I believe they call this a swell center because of the bump down here and the bump up here. And you've got a clip blade. This secondary blade that kind of looks like a sheepfoot, but it isn't a sheepfoot. And then you have another secondary blade, in this case a clip blade. So you've got a small clip blade and a large clip blade, and this other blade on here is called a coping blade, and the coping blade is what makes this, what would have been a stockman if it had a sheepfoot blade, a carpenter whittler. That's what this frame is usually referred to as, a carpenter's whittler, because it has a coping blade up at the top by the clip blade, and then it has another secondary clip blade down here. And these blades are more akin to actually working with wood than you find on a stockman. So while the knife looks like a stockman in all respects, because of the blade choices on it, it's referred to as a whittler. But today, this is not what most whittlers look like. It's gone even beyond this. Let me close these up so I don't cut anybody, and we'll move on to the next part. Now today, when people think of a whittler, they think of a specific type of frame. Notice this one. It looks very similar to this. I think this one's called a humpback because this one is a little straighter, so it isn't a completely swelled center, but you still see the bump on the back here. So this might be called a humpback whittler. But the blade you have on it here You notice you've got a clip blade here, and you have a secondary pin blade here, and then another clip blade. The interesting thing now is if you notice you have the two small blades down on this end, and then you have the large blade up on top. But more importantly, when you close it, do you see what happens? The main blade is dropping in between the two secondary blades. On a stockman, you have the main blade typically riding in front and then the two secondary blades in the back. Notice the difference of how the blades are laying. And that's really what makes most people think of a whittler. The whittler is the way the blades are aligned, and also the fact that that main blade is dropping in between the two smaller blades. And more importantly, if you notice here, now this one is called a split back whittler also because there is a split between those blades, allowing even more room for that main blade to drop between the two blades. But the most important thing about it is you have the main blade is actually operating off of two back springs, and the secondary blades, the two smaller blades, are working off of their own individual back spring. Now on a typical stockman, the main blade is operating off of one back spring. So what this means is you have a lot more force holding this blade in place than you do on a stockman. Stockman, one spring; whittler, two springs on the back spring. Now this one doesn't have a coping blade, but typically you find coping blades also on a whittler, especially if they're going to refer to it as a carpenter's whittler. But this is one of the main features that you look for in a whittler, is if it has a split back spring or if that main blade is dropping in between the two other blades. You will not always find the split back spring. But you see several different frames here. This one, like I said, is usually referred to as a humpback. This one is a swell center, even though this one is still laid out like a stockman. The blades on it, the blade choices are definitely whittler type blades. This one is laid out on a Congress frame, but you notice it's got the split back spring, and it has two secondary blades, the coping blade. So many people would just refer to this as a carpenter, and I guess you could simply because it has the coping blade on it, but typically the carpenter was laid out more like a stockman fashion. At least the traditional carpenter whittler was laid out like a stockman. But today, a lot of people will refer to any whittler with a coping blade a carpenter's whittler. And the coping blade is used for scribing and really small detail work. This one, though, as you can tell, is laid out, or it's on a Congress frame, so this is often referred to as a Congress whittler. But you also see the blade choices here. You have a Spearmaster, a pin blade, and a coping blade. I've also seen Congress whittlers that have a sheepfoot coping and a pin blade. I do not have one here. I do have one in my collection, though. This one is referred to as an equal end or a cigar whittler. Notice this one does not have a split back spring, but the main blade is still dropping in between the two the two smaller blades. And this one, really big spear blade. And even though it's a sheepfoot blade here, most people would still refer to this as a whittler simply because of the way the blade is laid out, or the blades are laid out. And a sheepfoot blade can be used similar to the way you would use a coping blade, but it also allows you for a lot of push cutting and stuff. So this is going to work for larger chores and larger tasks. The other secondary blade that was on here was a large pin blade. And like I said, this is usually referred to as an equal end or a carpenter's whittler. The little guy here is a sleeve board whittler. Again, a pin blade, a secondary pin blade, and a coping blade. So this could also be referred to as a carpenter's whittler or a carpenter's sleeve board whittler. And if you notice, again, it doesn't really have a split back spring, but if you can tell, the springs do widen at this end, giving a little more clearance for the main blade to drop. This is called a canoe whittler or a knittler. This is a very small one. I've shown it before. Has a a clip blade. Again, a small sheep foot, and then a small pin blade, and a split back. So it's really could be referred to as a split back knittler or split back canoe whittler. Another one, this nice little small one here, because both sides are swell, it would be referred to as a swell center whittler. It has a split back spring, and if you notice, the two small secondary blades, it's got a spearmaster in the middle, and one of the secondary blades is a small coping blade. And way back in the back here, this is a Sunfish whittler. Sunfish usually only have two blades, but as you can tell, this one has three blades. And again, the main blade is dropping in between the two smaller blades, and it is definitely operating off of both back springs. Notice it says Sunfish, so it is definitely a Sunfish, but because of the blade choices on here, it's not referred to as a three-blade Sunfish, it's referred to as a Sunfish whittler. Again, big coping blade, and a very large pin blade for the secondary. And there you have it, a Sunfish whittler. And probably the one that most people talk about is right here. This is called a Seahorse whittler. As you notice, it is still a type of sleeve board in that it's larger up here and narrow down here. That's what they're talking about with a sleeve board, because it would be like the way you would slip the sleeve onto an ironing board to iron. And if you ever look at a sleeve on a shirt, the end by the wrist is much smaller than the area by the armpit. So it just tapers down the whole length. This one's kind of bent by the elbow. Typical of a Sunfish whittler, it does not have a split back. And what makes it a Sunfish whittler a Seahorse whittler is the Wharncliffe blade at the top, and then at the bottom you have a small pin blade and a coping blade. And the concept is that when you have all the blades out like so, if I can get it to show, might have to back the camera up a bit. There we go. Notice the shape is seen as a seahorse when you have it like so. So that's why it's called a Seahorse whittler. And this is a pattern that is made by Case, made famous by Case also. And more what you see on whittlers, the blade choice that is big among whittlers, is the Wharncliffe blade. It is a blade that is excellent for use with wood, similar to the coping blade. But that flat bottom here is the part that they really like with whittling, because you can do a lot of push cutting, but you also have a very good point here for drilling and things of that nature. So, and because you have two back springs operating on that main blade, you have a lot more control and less likelihood of the blade closing on you. And that's the Whittler family, and that's how the Whittler actually became the Whittler. Yes, it started off basically as a stockman. At least the three-blade whittlers sort of started off as a stockman, or at least built, laid out like a stockman, but the blade choices made it a knife that was more conducive to whittling. And over time, with minor modifications, mainly leaving only one blade at the top and then the two smaller blades at the bottom, and having that one blade at the top operating off of both back springs. That's really what turned the Whittler into a pattern all of its own. Hope that helps people understand the Whittler. And if there's another pattern out there that you have a question about, go ahead and shoot it to me in a comment below. And if I've already made a video on it, I'll direct you to it. If not, I'll take a look at making a video on another pattern.
Thank you for visiting Knife Chats. I hope you enjoyed your time here. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel and ringing that notification bell so that you will be notified when the next episode of Knife Chats is up online. Thanks again. See you soon.